Clara Almeida, a 32-year-old, ambitious investigative journalist, leaned over a table in a small, dimly lit library in the heart of the countryside. Outside, a monotonous April rain of 2023 gently drummed against the old windowpane. It was already around 7 in the evening. The gray twilight barely penetrated the dusty glass, mingling with the dim light of a single table lamp. Clara was engrossed in her task. She had come to this secluded village not for peace, but in a desperate search. Her younger brother, Matvey, had gone missing about 6 months ago. The police had long closed the case, writing it off as an accident or runaway. But Clara didn't believe a word of it. She knew Matvey. He was too responsible, too attached to his family to simply disappear. Her fingers, covered in a light layer of library dust, slid across the yellowed pages of ancient maps and documents, which the local librarian had kindly, though with obvious distrust, provided. He was an old man with a perpetually furrowed brow. Clara was looking for anything, any clue, any mention of unusual events or old legends that might shed light on the mystery surrounding Matvey. The room was filled with the musty smell of old paper, dust, and moisture seeping in from the street. Finally, her gaze landed on one particularly dilapidated map. It was a map of the local church of the Pillar and the surrounding area. It was then that her finger accidentally, almost instinctively, slid across a small, barely noticeable mark on one of the maps. The mark was located in the corner where the foundation of the Church of the Pillar was depicted. At first, Clara thought it was just an old water stain or a mark of time that had added just another layer to the worn paper. The map, drawn, judging by the style many decades ago, was crisscrossed with cracks and abrasions. But when she looked closer, leaning in so that her breath fogged the paper slightly, she saw that these were not just random marks. They were thin, indecipherable scribbles, like some kind of symbols or very ancient, faded letters, which seemed to indicate something ominous. These symbols, applied in dull ink that almost blended into the background of the map, pointed to some hidden passages, probably in the base of the church. What she discovered had lain hidden under layers of time and oblivion. Judging by the condition of the paper, the mark could have been made decades ago, perhaps even 100 years ago. The map was not just dilapidated. It was riddled with traces of dampness and mold along the edges, which indicated that it had been stored in unfavorable conditions, perhaps in some damp basement or old chest. Most alarming was that these marks, these strange, coordinate-like symbols, were almost indecipherable. They were like an encrypted code. They portended something much deeper than just an architectural feature. This discovery, this tiny, almost invisible piece of evidence, would forever change the course of the case that had plagued this secluded village for many, many years, covering it with a shroud of unexplained disappearances. Clara Almeida, usually cold-blooded and reasonable, felt a chill run down her spine. She had no idea that this ordinary April evening, which began with a routine search in the archives, would become the most revolutionary and pivotal day of her life. She had always believed in logic and evidence, but what she held in her hands smelled of something much more ancient and sinister than an ordinary crime. What was about to be discovered had remained hidden in the shadows for decades, patiently awaiting this moment to come to light. In a few minutes, the mystery that had been kept for 4 decades would finally be revealed, and this small, once sleepy village, known only for its agricultural lands and old church, would never be the same after this shocking discovery. It was a harsh, but surprisingly warm summer of 1978. The sun was high in the sky, scorching the fields around the small, sleepy village, hidden deep in the countryside. The air was heavy with the smell of hay and wildflowers, mixed with the barely perceptible aroma of old stone, coming from the Church of the Pillar. This ancient temple, built in the 15th century, towered above the trees, and its dilapidated spire seemed to be the only landmark on the flat horizon. The church was not just a place of worship, it was an integral part of the history of the village. It was built over a network of natural caves, which, it was said, contained a labyrinth of tunnels long forgotten by time and covered with centuries of dust. Life in the village flowed slowly and predictably. The days were filled with the usual agricultural work, quiet conversations between neighbors on the doorsteps of their homes, and, of course, services at the Church of the Pillar. The children, including Matvei Almeida, who was only 10 years old at the time, spent their days playing in the streets, exploring the surroundings, and, of course, the ivy-covered churchyard. Matvei, with his curious disposition and insatiable thirst for adventure, often went further than the other children. He was known for his courage, which sometimes bordered on recklessness. He dreamed of becoming an explorer when he grew up. In the village, there were old, almost forgotten rumors of an ancient mechanism that, it was said, was hidden under the main altar of the Church of the Pillar. It was a movable tomb, a legendary device installed on massive metal rails. It was said that it was capable of transporting still living victims to a dark, damp crypt that, according to popular belief, extended deep under the neighboring cemetery. This mechanism was part of spooky tales. They were told by old women in the evenings sitting on benches near their houses under the light of kerosene lamps. These stories were part of village folklore, frightening tales that were passed down from generation to generation. However, despite their sinister nature, no one really took them seriously. They were just old stories designed to entertain children and pass the long evenings. No one could imagine that a terrifying reality was hidden behind them. Everything changed on one fateful, sweltering summer evening. The sun was already setting, painting the sky with fiery and orange tones, when Matvei Almeida, as usual, went to explore the caves, which, he believed, were full of adventures and hidden treasures. He was dressed in his favorite tattered shirt and short pants. His pockets were stuffed with pebbles and found feathers. His mother, Maria Almeida, called him from the doorway, asking him to be careful and come back before dark. Matvei waved to her, promising to return soon. That was the last time she saw him. Matvei never returned home for dinner. His disappearance shrouded the village in darkness, which was much thicker than ordinary night. The initial search was extensive, but completely useless. The entire village, from the youngest to the oldest, went out looking. They combed the forests, checked all the abandoned buildings, shouted his name until they were hoarse, but Matvei was nowhere to be found. The police arrived from the nearest town. They conducted their own investigation, but no trace of the boy was found. Soon people began to whisper. They remembered the old legends about the church, about the moving tomb. The church seemed to silently keep its secrets. Its stone walls seemed even colder and more impenetrable than usual. The villagers began to avoid the Church of the Pillar. Its once majestic appearance, its role in the center of public life, had now become a source of fear and distrust. What happened to Matvei? This question remained unanswered. Everything hung in the air like a curse. The Almeida family was devastated. Matvei's mother, Maria, almost stopped eating and sleeping. Her eyes were constantly red from tears. Her father, Joseph, became withdrawn and silent. A constant aura of grief and despair hung over their home. The village tried to return to normal life, but it was impossible. Every time someone passed by the Church of the Pillar, they felt a chill run down their spine. The building, which had once been a symbol of faith and hope, became a monument to an unexplained loss. Years passed. Decades replaced each other like pages in an old, forgotten book. The mystery of Matvei Almeida's disappearance, like many others before him, gradually faded from the memory of most of the villagers. No one whispered anymore about the strange disappearances, about the sinister rumors associated with the Church of the Pillar. The village seemed to have returned to its usual sleepy life, absorbed in the routine and cares of the harvest. But for some, for those who loved and remembered, the pain and questions remained. For the Almeida family, every day was a reminder of an irreparable loss, a wound that time could not heal. Over their home, once full of laughter, now hung a constant aura of grief and despair. Maria Almeida, Matvei's mother, almost stopped eating and sleeping. Her eyes were constantly red from tears. Her father, Joseph, became withdrawn and silent, his shoulders drooping under the weight of an unbearable burden. The village lived its life, but an atmosphere of constant secrecy hung in the air, like an invisible veil, enveloping every resident. No one dared to talk about the missing, Their names were not spoken aloud, so as not to disturb the peace that was only apparent. It was an unwritten rule, a tacit agreement that everyone adhered to. The Church of the Pillar and its massive stone walls covered with centuries of moss stood like a grim guardian. Its bell tower rose above the village like a finger pointing to the sky, keeping its secrets. Every morning its bells rang, calling parishioners to service. But the ringing now seemed not so much a call to faith, but a funeral knell, a reminder of those who had disappeared. Passing by the church, people felt an inexplicable chill, even on the hottest summer day. It was more than just an old building. It was a monument to an unspoken horror. What really happened to those who disappeared in the bowels of this ancient church? Their fate was much more terrible than anyone could have imagined in their worst nightmares. The victims did not just disappear, did not die in accidents. They were kidnapped, they were held captive deep underground in damp, dark tunnels that no one suspected. There, in the heart of this underground labyrinth, they became part of macabre rituals conducted by a secret confraternity. It was not just a gathering of religious fanatics. It was a powerful and ruthless alliance consisting of the clergy and influential families of the village. Among them were elders, wealthy landowners, even some representatives of local authorities, whose names would never have been associated with such evil. They sought power and influence, eternal life and endless wealth. Their motives were vile. Their souls were corrupted by greed and insane ambitions. They believed that these ancient rituals, which included sacrifice, would bring them eternal dominion over this land and its inhabitants. They were sure that they would receive some divine blessing that would make them untouchable. The head of the confraternity, the village elder, a man with a benevolent face and sharp eyes, was a ruthless and calculating man. His name was Lucas Petrov. He maintained secrecy with all his might, with an iron hand, suppressing any resistance. Anyone who came close to the truth, who asked too many questions, who began to suspect, disappeared without a trace, swelling the ranks of those who were absorbed by the darkness of the Church of the Pillar. There were clear signs that the secret was maintained with incredible care. For example, the strange disappearance of archival records from the local registry office concerning some missing persons, or the suspicious silence of those who might know more but preferred not to speak. Their faces were pale with fear. The power of the confraternity was absolute. Its influence extended to all aspects of village life, from economic activity to appointments to government positions. They were the unspoken rulers of the village, controlling everything that happened. The suffering of the victims was inexpressible. Confined in dark, damp chambers, they lived in constant fear. Their days merged into an endless series of horrors. They were fed only occasionally to keep them alive for the rituals. The sounds of dripping water and sinister whispers were their only companions. Many lost their minds in this darkness. Their screams echoed through the tunnels, not reaching the surface. However, some retained a grain of hope, a faint spark of faith that one day the truth would come out, that their suffering would not be in vain. They scratched their names on the walls, short messages, dates, hoping that someone would one day find these pieces of evidence of their existence. It was these scratches, these silent cries for help, that Clara would later discover. Among the members of the confraternity was one man who bore a heavy burden of guilt and remorse on his shoulders. It was Father Antonio, the parish priest of the Church of the Pillar. He was about 60 years old. His hair was gray, and his face was covered with deep wrinkles reflecting years of inner struggle. He was a respected and revered man in the village. His sermons were full of wisdom and compassion. But under his cassock, under his pious appearance, lay a deep, agonizing secret. When he was a young priest, he was tricked into joining the confraternity, convinced that their rituals were aimed at preserving ancient traditions and protecting the village from external threats. He was shown only a small part of what was really happening. Over time, as he learned more, his horror grew. He saw with his own eyes what was happening to the victims. He heard their pleas. His conscience constantly tormented him. He tried to leave, but the threats to his family, to his own life, were too great. He was a prisoner like the victims, but his prison was psychological, and his chains were made of fear and complicity. He lived a double life, preaching the word of God by day and serving the devil by night. This constant contradiction gnawed at his soul, making him weak but at the same time a potential key to the truth. He, one of the few, knew the exact location of the hidden tunnels, the details of the mechanism under the altar, and the names of all the members of the confraternity. In his old Bible, which he always carried with him, between the yellowed pages were encrypted prophecies and records of every ritual he conducted in a desperate attempt to ease his conscience. He hoped that one day these records would be found and the truth would be revealed. The arrival of Clara Almeida in the village, this quiet, at first glance, corner of the world, broke the long and agonizing silence that hung in the air like a heavy fog. She was not just another curious journalist looking for a sensation. She was a sister whose heart was broken by grief and uncertainty. Her dedication to the cause, her determination to find Matvei, was unwavering, like an ancient stone that cannot be moved. From the very first day, Clara felt like an outsider. The locals met her with suspicious glances. Their faces were closed and expressionless. Their words were meager and cautious. There was a barely perceptible but tangible smell of fear and secrecy in the air. In the village, like a weak but persistent stream, rumors circulated. They were barely audible, but they penetrated every corner. There were whispers about a hearse that, according to the stories, had been locked inside the Church of the Pillar for 2 weeks. The strangest thing was that it had never transported a single corpse. This rumor, strange and inexplicable, only strengthened Clara's determination. She instinctively felt that something was deeply wrong in this village, that behind its calm appearance lay a dark, rotting secret. She understood that these rumors, like breadcrumbs, were meant to lead her to the truth. Her main confidant, the very whistleblower who held the key to the mystery in her hands, became Senora Mercedes. She was the oldest resident of the village. Her age was 93 years. She lived in a small, dilapidated house that was almost completely hidden by an overgrown but well-kept garden full of fragrant roses and wild grasses. Her eyes, deep and wise, had seen a lot. Their gaze was piercing and sad. Senora Mercedes was the keeper of oral stories, a living encyclopedia of village traditions, legends, and forgotten events. She knew everything. She had seen generations change, people being born and dying, the village sinking into ever deeper silence and secrecy. Senora Mercedes, despite her age, was remarkably clear-minded. She was a deeply religious woman, and her conscience, burdened by decades of silence, could no longer bear the weight of this secret. She felt that her time was running out, and she could not die without revealing the truth. The old woman believed that this was her last service. Her motive was simple and pure. She had carried this burden for decades, watching grief and fear devour families, young lives disappearing, swallowed up by this darkness. Clara, listening to her stories, realized that Senora Mercedes was the very whistleblower, the living witness, who was finally ready to reveal the truth, despite the risk to herself. The old woman, with hands trembling with age but resolute, pointed Clara to the old, yellowed maps that Clara had found in the library. She explained to Clara that these maps, which she kept in an old carved chest under her bed, showed secret passages and marked the places where the ghastly secrets were hidden. There were also notes about forbidden rituals, written in her own handwriting. She had kept these records secretly, meticulously, recording everything she managed to find out. Clara immediately realized that this was the key to the mystery. These were not just old maps. They were evidence steeped in history and pain. Senora Mercedes, whose voice was quiet but surprisingly confident, told Clara about ancient legends, which were actually encrypted warnings. She mentioned the strange events associated with the church, which began even before Matvei's disappearance. Her trembling hands pointed to certain symbols on the maps. She said that the families of the missing deserved to know that their suffering should not be in vain. She said that this information had been hidden from them for too long. They had been kept in the dark for too many years. The tension grew with every word of Senora Mercedes. Her words, like needles, pierced the veil of lies. Clara felt that she was approaching the terrible truth, the heart of the darkness that had swallowed up her brother and many others. She realized the danger, but it was too late to retreat. Senora Mercedes, tired but full of determination, gave Clara precise instructions. She told her about the hidden lever behind the confessional, about the secret entrance to the tunnel, about what to look for in terms of tracks and signs. Clara listened attentively, memorizing every word, every gesture of the old woman. She felt that this was not just information, it was a testament passed from hand to hand, in the hope of justice. Clara promised Senora Mercedes that she would not stop until she had revealed the whole truth. One night, Clara decided to act. The village was asleep, shrouded in a thick blanket of darkness and silence, only occasionally broken by the distant barking of dogs. The sky was moonless. The stars barely twinkled through a thin layer of clouds, increasing the feeling of isolation and mystery. Clara, dressed in dark clothes to blend in with the night, armed herself with a small but powerful flashlight that her father had given her for camping. Her heart was pounding in her chest, beating out in Dvořákův rhythm, but her determination was unwavering. She went to the Church of the Pillar, which towered above the village like a giant dark shadow. The old building, with its sharp spire and massive stone walls, seemed even more sinister in the dark. Inside the church, there was absolute silence. The air was cold and stagnant, smelling of dust, old wood, and mold. The only sound was the faint whistle of the wind penetrating through the broken windows and the beating of Clara's own heart. She moved cautiously, directing the beam of the flashlight along the walls, following Senora Mercedes' instructions. Her footsteps echoed in the empty nave like the footsteps of ghosts. She passed the pews darkened by time and approached the confessional, an old wooden structure that looked as if no one had used it for decades. Behind the confessional, her hand felt for what Senora Mercedes had called a slight bulge in the stone wall. It was an uneven protrusion, barely noticeable if one did not know its exact location. Clara ran her fingers over the surface, feeling the cold, rough stone. Then her fingers stumbled upon something metallic. It was an ancient lever, completely covered with a thick layer of red rust that blended in with the color of the stone, making it almost invisible. It was heavy and cold to the touch. Its surface was uneven. Clara took a deep breath. She pulled the lever down, applying all her strength. First, nothing happened. Then there was a screech, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. Slowly, with a rumble and a squeak, the massive stone panel, which had previously seemed an integral part of the wall, began to move aside. It opened a dark, damp entrance to a tunnel. From there wafted the smell of damp earth, mold, and something even heavier that Clara could not identify but that gave her goosebumps. This smell was the smell of stagnant air and something long forgotten. Clara went down the rickety, uneven steps. Her flashlight snatched only the nearest meters from the darkness. The tunnel was narrow and low, the walls were damp to the touch, and the ceiling sagged in places. The silence was broken only by the constant monotonous dripping of water falling from somewhere above, creating a spooky acoustics. There were also faint, almost inaudible echoes that seemed to come from nowhere. Clara initially thought it was her imagination, but then she realized that these were sounds that other people had once made long ago. She lit up the walls. On them, deep scratched marks were clearly visible, like scratches from chains, and on the floor grooves, as if something heavy had been dragged across the stones. This was irrefutable evidence of the horrifying events that had taken place here. It was then, in the dim light of the flashlight, that her gaze fell on something that made her heart stop. On one of the walls, just above eye level, a small metal plate was attached. It was covered with dust and cobwebs, but the engraved initials were clearly visible on it. Several initials, but one of them, M.A., was particularly clear. These were the initials of her brother, Matvei Almeida. Clara felt an icy chill run down her spine. These were not just initials, they were silent cries for help. These were traces of those who had passed here before, those who may have gone this way never to return. She ran her fingers over the engraved letters, feeling their rough surface. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she quickly brushed them away. She had to be strong. Moving through the tunnel, Clara discovered old metal rails built right into the stone floor. They were covered with a thick layer of dust and rust, but their purpose was obvious. These were the rails that were spoken of in the legends, the rails for the moving tomb. She followed them, trying not to make any extra noise. The tunnel became more and more narrow and winding, and it was then, when she turned another corner, that Clara almost ran into a hooded figure. The figure stood motionless, like part of the shadow, and then, as if dissolving into the air, disappeared into the darkness. This confirmed her worst fears. She was not alone in this search. Someone else was here in these dark dungeons, and that someone was possibly the one who was hiding the truth. Deep in the dungeon, in the heart of this grim labyrinth, Clara entered a large hall carved into the rock. In the center of the hall, a massive, eerie sarcophagus on rails towered like a silent witness to ancient horror. It was made of dark, polished stone, and its surface was cold and smooth to the touch. On its sides were traces of ancient symbols and engravings that Clara could not decipher. But the worst thing was something else. On the inner sides of the sarcophagus, internal latches were visible. They were massive, heavy, and clearly designed to keep a prisoner alive inside. This meant that the victims were not simply killed. They were transported alive to this hidden hall. Here, the secret brotherhood, the confraternity, conducted their macabre rituals. Their goal was one, to gain power. This was such a horrifying discovery that Clara felt nauseous. It was here, in this sinister hall, that Father Antonio met her. He stood in the shadows. His figure was shrouded in twilight. His face was pale and drawn. His eyes, usually kind and wise, were now filled with pain and despair. He was a respected parish priest, a man whose word was valued in the village, and who always seemed burdened by some unbearable weight beyond his priestly vestments. Now, his burden had become obvious. He was torn between his duty, his promise, his obligation to defend the 1,000-year-old faith he preached, and the unbearable weight of his own sins and his complicity in this nightmare. He wavered. His hand, thin and trembling, lifted the old Bible he always carried with him. This Bible, as Clara now knew, was not just a sacred scripture. Between its yellowed pages were encrypted prophecies and hidden records that he had kept for years, records of every ritual, of every sacrifice. Clara understood she was facing a choice, a terrible dilemma. Reveal her discovery to the world, a world that might not be ready to face such a shocking truth, which could shatter all their notions of faith and morality, or bury the secret forever to preserve the fragile harmony of the community, which, as she now understood, was built on lies and suffering. Clara realized that if she backed down now, and if she allowed fear to take hold of her, she risked becoming the next victim. She risked being trapped in a moving tomb hidden beneath the altar of the Church of the Pillar. The truth had come out, and it was even more terrifying than she could have imagined. When Father Antonio finally uttered the words that had been hidden for decades, the village plunged into chaos unlike anything she had ever seen before. The truth, which had been locked away for so long in the dark depths of the Church of the Pillar, exploded like a powerful bomb. Its shards scattered in all directions, destroying all their conceptions of the world. The residents were in shock. Their faces were pale, and their eyes were wide with horror and disbelief. They could not believe what they were hearing. The people they had trusted, the people they had turned to for spiritual guidance and help, turned out to be monsters. The children who played in the cemetery, their laughter echoing through the churchyard, were now recognized as victims. They became victims of the very people who were supposed to protect them, those who held high positions in their community. The unveiling of the truth began with Father Antonio's desperate confession. He stood before Clara. His voice was hoarse with emotion and guilt. He told her everything. He described how the confraternity, this secret organization, had been kidnapping people for years using an ancient mechanism under the altar. He spoke of a hidden hall where their horrific rituals were conducted, of a sarcophagus on rails that transported living victims. He named names, one after another, revealing the identities of those who belonged to this sinister group. Lucas Petrov, the village elder, his son-in-law, a powerful lawyer, even the head of the local police, who had been falsifying missing persons reports all these years. Clara recorded every word. Her hand was shaking, but her mind remained clear. It turned out that Matvei Almeida, Clara's brother, was one of the latest victims. Thanks to Father Antonio's testimony and Clara's meticulous plan, a raid was organized. Matvei was found in the hidden hall, in the very chamber where he had been held. He was weakened, exhausted, and traumatized, but to the incredible relief of Clara and the entire family, he was alive. His eyes were empty, but he recognized his sister. His rescue triggered a wave of relief throughout the village, but it also brought a new, powerful wave of anger and a thirst for justice. Matvei was not the only one. Throughout the dungeon, other survivors were discovered. Several adults and children who had disappeared years earlier were found in appalling conditions. They were pale, emaciated, many barely able to speak, but they were alive. Their stories, told haltingly, through tears and nightmares, were horrifying. They revealed the full extent of the deception, cruelty, and perversion that had flourished in the depths of the Church of the Pillar. Horrific evidence was also found, human remains hidden deep in the farthest tunnels, confirming that not all the victims had managed to survive. This was proof that no one wanted to see. The confraternity was exposed. Its members, those who considered themselves untouchable, were arrested. Among them were the most prominent figures in the village. Their faces, filled with smugness just yesterday, were now contorted with fear and despair. Their reputations were ruined forever. Their names became synonymous with betrayal and evil. Lucas Petrov, the elder, tried to flee, but was caught on the outskirts of the village. His gaze was insane as he was dragged away. Father Antonio was also arrested. He was charged with complicity for knowing what was happening and remaining silent. His actions were condemned by most. His reputation was destroyed. However, in court, he stood pale, but with unexpected strength in his voice, and spoke of his own inner struggle. He confessed to his weakness and fear, but also spoke of his remorse and how Clara had given him the courage to finally act. He revealed every detail of the conspiracy, about the rituals, about the sacrifices, and about how the confraternity kept people in fear using threats and manipulation. His testimony, full of pain and remorse, became key to the conviction of the remaining members of the confraternity. He knew that punishment awaited him, but he was ready to accept it, knowing that he had finally done the right thing. The village was in turmoil. Trust was undermined, and its peaceful existence was shattered forever. The community was divided. Families were devastated to learn that their loved ones had been kidnapped and tortured. But amidst this chaos, there was also hope. The survivors began to recover slowly. Their bodies and souls needed long healing. They found support in each other, in their families, and especially in Clara, who became a symbol of justice for them. The story of Matvei and the others became more than just a tragedy. It became a warning, a lesson that evil can hide behind a mask of virtue, that one must be vigilant and never lose faith in the truth. Life in the village never returned to what it was. The ruined Church of the Pillar stood as a grim reminder of the past. The spire was broken, and the windows were boarded up. The bells no longer rang. Their silence was louder than any sound. The old secrets were revealed, and their weight lay on the shoulders of every resident. Matvei was recovering slowly but surely. He spent many months in the hospital, undergoing physical and psychological rehabilitation. But he was alive, and that was the most important thing. His reunion with Clara and his sister was one of the most emotional of his life. They embraced in tears. Their tears were a mixture of sorrow for the past and relief that they were together again. Their bond, once strong, was now unbreakable, forged in the fire of suffering. The secret confraternity was completely disbanded. Its members were imprisoned. Their names were blacklisted in the history of the village, but their actions left deep, unhealed scars in the hearts of the survivors and their families. The village began the agonizing process of healing. It was slow, step by step, like relearning to walk after a long illness. People learned to trust each other again, to rebuild the destroyed bridges. They learned to live with the truth, with the realization that darkness had lived among them for so long. Many families whose loved ones had disappeared decades ago finally received answers. They could mourn their relatives, knowing what had happened to them, and this gave them some semblance of peace that they had been deprived of for so long. The legacy of this story was complex and multifaceted. It was tragic, filled with pain and horror, but it was also hopeful. It showed that the truth, no matter how terrible, will always find a way to come out, even if it is hidden for decades. It also showed that resistance is possible, that even in the darkest circumstances there are people who are willing to fight for justice. Evil can be defeated, but it takes incredible courage, unwavering determination, and a willingness to act. This was a lesson for all the residents of the village, a reminder that one must be vigilant, that one must fight for justice, and that one must cherish those moments of peace and tranquility that we have because they can be fragile and fleeting. Clara Almeida did not return to her former job. Her experience changed her forever. She became a lawyer, dedicating her life to helping victims of similar crimes, fighting for the truth. She established a foundation in memory of Matvi and all those who suffered, helping others find answers and justice. The story of the Church of the Pillar became known throughout the country, becoming a grim tale, a warning about the dark forces that can lurk in the most unexpected places. And although the pain of loss will never completely disappear, the village slowly but surely began to recover. Its residents, taught by bitter experience, became stronger and more united than ever before, remembering the price they had to pay for the truth.